Welcome back to Psyched for Peds, the child mental health podcast for pediatric clinicians and for all of us taking care of kids. We're helping you help kids. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Faluca, child psychiatrist and mom. So last episode, we talked about preschoolers and about identifying significant behavioral and emotional problems in preschool-aged kids. Specifically, we talked about how to use a free parent form called the Brief EXA, or the Brief Early Childhood Screening Assessment. And this parent report form screens for behavioral and emotional problems in preschoolers, kids 5 years and younger, and also looks at symptoms of caregiver stress and caregiver depression. Today, I want to talk about why it is so important to routinely check in with parents of preschool-age kids to assess their stress level and their well-being. And what I want to say is most pediatric practices have gotten so good and consistent about routinely screening moms at postpartum visits at 1, 2, 4, and 6-month visits for signs of postpartum depression and or postpartum anxiety. This is something that most pediatric clinicians are already very good at. But what I'd like you to consider is that it's important to look at parental well-being and parental stress levels later in the child's life, specifically during preschool. But don't just take my word for it. I'm going to review a little bit of the data and important research that talks about the close association between behavioral and emotional problems in kids and symptoms of depression in caregivers. And spoiler alert, I'm going to share interesting findings from a study that some colleagues and I did about this specific area. So, why should pediatric clinicians care about parental stress and depression? And I've heard a lot of people argue strongly and rightly that the parent is not your patient. And that is 100% true. The parent is not our patient. However, obviously, the parent is a strong part of the child's development, and well-being in parents is strongly associated with social and emotional development in kids. And this is particularly important during the child's sensitive period of emotional and social development, which is 5 years and younger. So what we know is there is a super strong relationship between behavioral and emotional problems in kids and depressive symptoms in parents. So let's think about that. So that means that the kids that have significant behavioral and emotional problems are much more likely to have parents with depressive symptoms, and vice versa, that the parents who have symptoms of depression and symptoms of stress are much more likely to have kids with behavioral and emotional problems. In some ways, this makes a lot of sense, but I just want to talk to you about kind of how I think through that. We know that parental depression negatively impacts child well-being because the parent, when you're depressed, you are much less responsive to your child's needs. And your child is looking to you to help them when they fall down, when they cry, when they're upset, to be their security blanket, to be their buffer, their somebody to help them regulate their own emotions. And when as a parent, that's difficult for you to do because of depression, that's going to affect the child's emotional regulation in a negative way. That's going to make children at higher risk of being irritable, of having a low mood, of having anxiety. We are disrupting the critical attachment system between the parent and the child during their critical time of development. So in short, depression in parents increases the risk of behavioral and emotional problems in kids. And of course, this is not just a one-way street. As any of us who have parented young children know in our core, that parenting young children is very stressful. In particular, if you're parenting a child with behavioral and emotional problems, that adds extra stress on top of that can exacerbate or potentially precipitate depression in the parents. I wanted to share two really fascinating statistics about the prevalence of depression symptoms in parents of very young kids, like preschool age kids. So 1 out of 10 dads of preschool age kids has experienced a depressive episode in the first 4 years of their child's life. That is really high, especially because we know that men typically are at lower risk of depression than women. So 1 out of 10 dads experiences a depressive episode in the first 4 years of their child's life. Now we talk about moms who already have an increased risk of depression. And we know in the first 4 years of their child's life, 1 out of 4 moms has experienced a depressive episode. Oh my goodness. So the bottom line is that parents of very young kids, or particularly those ages 4 and under, are at high risk of developing depression. And when a parent or a caregiver has depression, this increases the risk of the child having behavioral and emotional problems and negatively impacts the child's own social and emotional development during the preschool period. And so this is why it is so important to have a systematic tool like the brief EXA to be able to assess for not only child behavioral and emotional problems, but also symptoms of caregiver depression. So when we hear data like this, it's really interesting. And I often hear from my pediatric colleagues that they want to know, what does this relationship between caregiver depression and preschool behavioral problems look like in a pediatric primary care setting? And so to answer that, I'm going to tell you about a study that our team published in the Journal of Child and Family Studies. And for this study, we went into a number of pediatric primary care practices to look at the relationship between preschool behavior problems and caregiver symptoms of depression. We examined a total of over 2,600 caregiver child dyads, and we had them complete the EXA so that we could assess for behavioral and emotional problems in kids, as well as symptoms of depression in parents. And here's what we found. 12% of kids ages 3 to 5 years old had positive EXAs, so a positive screen concerning for emotional and behavioral problems that could benefit from further assessment. That sounds normal because we know about 1 in 10 preschool age kids have significant behavioral and emotional problems. Also, we found boys were more likely to have positive screens than girls. Again, also expected in this age group. But the things that surprised us were what we found out about caregiver depressive symptoms. In our sample, what we found out is that dads were just as likely to have symptoms of depression as moms. And this is unusual because women typically experience depression at a rate that is much higher than men. Other things that we found are that those caregivers who identified as African American, Asian or Pacific Islander, or multiple races were much more likely to endorse depressive symptoms than those who identified as white. As expected, what we found is that children with significant behavioral and emotional problems were much more likely to also have a caregiver with depression. About 14% of the parents whose kids had positive screens for behavioral and emotional problems had depressive symptoms. In other words, more than 1 in 10 of the parents who had children with behavioral problems endorsed depression in the parents themselves. And it didn't matter if the parent was a dad or a mom, they were equally as likely to experience symptoms of depression. So again, emphasizing parenting kids in early childhood is hard and stressful, and symptoms of stress and depression are potentially higher than we would expect and are strongly associated with childhood behavioral and emotional problems. And we really got into the weeds to try to figure out if there were particular symptoms that were more likely to predict caregiver depression. What we found is that 3 of the child symptoms that were most strongly predictive of caregiver depressive symptoms were having a child with any sort of developmental delay, which we would expect because we know there's higher rates of caregiver stress and caregiver mental health problems among those caregivers who are taking care of little kids with developmental delays. The other 2 child symptoms that predicted depressive symptoms in parents were, my child doesn't seem to have much fun, and my child is irritable and easily annoyed. So both of those symptoms, especially taken together, are typically not found frequently in healthy developing young kids. I mean, if you think about preschoolers, they are the epitome of fun, and certainly not when they're having their temper tantrums, but they love to explore. They're excited about new things. Sometimes they even think looking for bugs is fun. So having a child whose parent says that they don't seem to have much fun, that is a definite red flag and can be specific for a hallmark symptom of preschool depression. The other symptom of my child is irritable and easily annoyed. Again, you wouldn't expect to see frequent irritability in a preschool age child, apart from the temper tantrums and times where they're completely exhausted and or hungry or hangry. Typically developing children would not be described as frequently irritable. So as clinicians, what I would say is if you have a child who you're concerned about significant irritability or even potentially anhedonia. The child doesn't seem to enjoy things, doesn't seem to have fun. Those two particular child symptoms on the EXA are concerning for a major mood disorder or something more serious and should be taken really seriously. If you're interested in learning more about this study, certainly message me on our website at psyched4peds.com or check us out online, Journal of Child and Family Studies. But what I would say is a take-home message from all of this is that depressive symptoms and stress among parents of preschoolers are very common. And using an instrument like the brief EXA or the EXA that assesses for child behavior problems and caregiver stress and depression can open the door to having a discussion with families who may be struggling. So it may be easier for the parents to fill out a checklist asking them about their stress and symptoms of depression than perhaps being asked coldly at their child's well visit. And if they endorse having symptoms of stress and depression, it's easier to know that before you even go in the room, to be able to see it on the completed EXA and use that to open a discussion with them, to check in and see how they're doing. Say, hey, I noticed you mention that you're sometimes getting more irritable than you want to with your child, and validate that this is a really hard time and check in to see how they really are doing and to see if they need more support. And we know, of course, the parent is not our patient. It's not our job to fix them or to help them get better. But what can be incredibly helpful as pediatric clinicians is just having a conversation with the parent and validating how hard it is to be taking care of young kids. And if you feel like it's reasonable to share the data and the stats that we know about parents of young kids being at really high risk of experiencing depression and stress, that could normalize that this is part of why we're checking in with you, because we know it is really hard. And then the next step is just encouraging them to reach out to their support system, their family, their friends, their OBGYN, their primary care doctor, to make sure that they're getting the support that they need to be able to take care of their little ones and to be able to help their own child's social and emotional well-being. I hope you find this useful or something to try out as part of your practice. I'd strongly encourage you to download the brief EXA, available for free on our website, psyched4peds. It's on the resource page, and you just click the blue button there that says get a copy of the brief EXA. And I think opening the door to these conversations about child emotional behavioral problems and parent well-being is so important and could be a really big step in trying to encourage kids and parents to get the help that they need for their own emotional well-being. All right, thanks again for joining us at Psyched for Peds. If you like this episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review, or share this episode with a friend. Continue to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on social media at psyched4peds, and check out our website at psyched4peds.com. All right, take care. See you next week.